Welcome back. Looking at the economy and the game. It's not a game, and the play with the National Assembly, how they both intertwine. In the fourth quarter report of 2022, the Debt Management Office said Nigeria's debt hovered around 46.25 trillion. Specifically, the total domestic debt stock was about 27.55 trillion naira, while the external debt stock was at 18.70 trillion naira. But despite this level of indebtedness or debt profile, the current administration has written to the Senate requesting approval to borrow from the World Bank about $800 million to help or cushion the effect of subsidy removal. Now, what would this impact have? I mean, we talked about it, the reactions to this request by the executive to the National Assembly, all manner of reactions. But we have in the studio here an economist, public policy scholar, and a former presidential candidate, rather, in 2019 elections of the Abundant Nigeria Renewal Party, Dr. Fasua. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Nyota.
Dr. Fasua, the last time we spoke, you had not studied deep enough to be called a doctor, but you've gone ahead to, so to speak.
No, that's been done since more than 2 years
That's
now.
why I said the last time we spoke. I was talking to you.
Oh, okay, you're welcome back to
but let's look at this. For one who's been, you've had these conversations about the Nigerian economy and what's being done over and over and over again. We've heard from the DMO in 2022 talking about Nigeria's debt profile. With that kind of profile and these new requests, so to speak, we heard the Senate President reading that letter from the executive requesting for approval to borrow $800 million. Considering also what that $800 million is meant for, it's supposed to touch approximately, I want to get that figure correctly, some vulnerable people in the society. 5,000 or thereabout will be shared amongst these vulnerable people. About over 10 million people are going to benefit from that. If I get the figure correct, then I stand to be corrected. But you're not happy about that. You're not even smiling. I mean, hearing this.
Well, I'm smiling.
Because the economy, you've talked about the economy of the individual impacting the economy of the nation.
Right.
So why shouldn't this go ahead?
Well, I think the real problem I have with it is the fact that it's the purpose for which it is meant to be deployed. It can only be inflationary. And we've heard that too many times. We heard that over COVID, X amount of money given to X amount of poor people in some place, right? And at the end of the day, we don't see the salutary impact. We should be doing life-changing things in Nigeria. I've studied quite a bit about how the Chinese have been able to take so many people out of poverty, what they call the targeted poverty eradication program. And it's fundamental. They go right to the basis of it. They take the data. They know what the needs of different households are. It's in all history about poverty eradication and what have you. It's never been about sharing money. So I vehemently disagree with what the government is trying to do. Based on the fact that they want to share 5,000 naira for 6 months. To 10 million households, which intends to impact about 50 million or 60 million people, because maybe 5 people per household. 10 million households, 5,000. I mean, what impact will 5,000 naira have? So I think we've got a big problem. And again, of course, the government is rounding up, this administration is rounding up in about 19 days or 18 days. In 18 days, if they collect the loan, and legally it is meant for such handouts, it's going to bind the next government, the next administration, to continue down that line for at least 6 months. And I think this is not a proper way. It's not if you like, appropriate way of spending money at this stage. Not even for the purpose of subsidy removal. It still won't work. I believe we've got to the point now where we need to remove the subsidy on fuel. Almost everybody has agreed on that. We've seen that, look, there seems to be some black hole between 3 to 4 trillion, or even 5 trillion every year that we're pumping money into this. You know, whenever the NNPC sells the crude, they use 90% or sometimes 100% of the proceeds to buy fuel, and you know, which they sell at a discount, and that money goes into that black hole. So we've agreed. However, how do we proceed? I personally have written on that in some of my articles, and I've suggested, for example, one critical way, one thing we can do, rather than pumping money and saying that money, helicopter money that we may not be able to trace, why don't we say, for example, the payee, the pay as you earn, personal income tax law can be amended very, very slightly, such that every worker in the private and public sector gets something back in their pocket, apart from those who are top earners, maybe guys like you. You know, but if somebody is earning anything like 1.5 million and below, you grade it. The guy earning 1.5 million, even if all you are giving him is maybe 10,000 naira back, you know, you're doing. But as he comes down, 5,000 naira in the pockets of someone who earns 50,000, you know, which you are giving back as payee, it's something. And this is like, you're increasing his transport allowance. So by that, in that mode, you're going to be taking care of a huge chunk of people who work, whether in the public sector or the private sector. So you have to talk to the states who are in charge. I mean, the states collect most of the PITs and so on, payee. You talk to them and say, guys, this is what we're going to do. The money you're going to be giving up by way of payee, you're going to get back by way of an increased FAC allocation, because now whatever is sold by the NNPC comes in directly and we're not paying subsidy anymore. You can also work on the CIT, company income tax, and you're going to be achieving two things. By reducing company income tax a little bit for every company, you're putting some more money back into the hands of each company. You can then tell them, look, we have done this so that you can also retain your staff. You don't have to sack staff. You can employ even more people, and we are promoting your businesses. You can do a lot more. So in which case, you know, so why are we not talking about that? Why are we talking about that kind of very base idea of we want to go and give some family, which, you know, we have a problem with our data. We went and did trade that money. We don't know where the money ended. We don't have data of who was the market money, all sorts of things, COVID money. And now we're talking about this 18 days to the, so on that basis, I will not accept. The only reason, the only window in which I may be able to say, okay, maybe we have something here, will be if they say, okay, look, this money, we're taking this loan and it's targeted towards subsidy removal. However, we're going to leave the next government to take a decision about how it to be spent, because we could use that money. $800 million is about 400 billion naira, okay? The subsidy we're trying to eradicate is about 4 trillion naira, 4 trillion naira. If you're borrowing this money, you can say that apart from the payee and the CIT that I mentioned now, you want to use this 400 billion naira now to incentivize the states. You know, how many buses can we buy from Innocent for each state, which are going to be maybe subsidized public transport? Even though that's not particularly very efficient, we've done that in the past. How much can we give to Lagos State to further improve its metro system? Which other state wants to begin to start a metro system? Fundamental investments in infrastructure that will be lasting, so that we can walk away finally from this subsidy quagmire, you know, and do something new. But certainly not this idea of, I mean, it's the basest idea, is the most colorless idea I've heard in a while. But of course, you know, I think in this administration, not many fantastic economic ideas are floated to the top. So this is going to be like you know, some sort of climax, okay, or perhaps call it anticlimax to the raft of, you know, uncooked policy, if you ask me, that we have managed to plow through over 8 years.
Talking about this is a way of giving back to the Nigerian people. 1 second, but you move this conversation to the tax regime in Nigeria.
Yeah.
There are not many people, and there's data to prove that there are not many people that are paying this tax, so to speak. I mean, the companies are not paying as much.
You're paying, aren't you?
I am paying.
I'm paying as well.
And my organization is paying taxes as well. But then, what I'm saying is there are not as many people paying taxes as they should be.
As they should be.
Instead of encouraging, you're now saying, would this idea now of giving back, how would that encourage people to pay tax?
Exactly.
When the government is also considering bringing in more tax regimes.
People will be encouraged to pay tax because you are reducing the burden, all right? So when you reduce the burden, but again, it depends on government communication. Government is now going to be saying that, listen, we've given you guys so much. We've said, okay, you know what, we've put money back in people's, and then the government will have the impetus, whether the state government or the federal, for enforcement, all right? So, in fact, you know what, there are many companies in the private sector now who collect this payee from their staff on a monthly basis, including NHF, Housing Fund, including even NHIS, and they don't remit. And that's a crime against the state. So if the government is going to be saying, look, we want to reach out to people. I mean, you pay payee, I pay payee. Let's look at the number of people who are in paid employment in this country. In the public service alone, we have about 2 million. And we're looking at, we're talking about plus police, plus army, including, the federal government, federal civil services is less than 100,000, truly. Then you look at all the guys who work in oil sector, in banks, in private company. We're probably going to be taking care of about 10 million people through that. And imagine that if the lives of those 10 million people were better, there's a trickle-down effect to their family members and what have you. Look, that's the best way you can begin to say, we have given something back. And then you now say, look, we need to enforce to ensure that if companies collect payee from their staff, it must be remit. We're now beginning to go in one fell swoop. We're now beginning to pursue the revenue to GDP ratio that we say is so low. Okay, and I heard Mr. Akabeze, speak yesterday or the day before about our low, of course, the fact that the debt, maybe become an issue, and that our revenue to GDP ratio is still very small. Indeed it is. However, I believe there are so many levels of control that we can begin to use, okay, to increase that revenue, by all means, across the board. We should be targeting doubling the revenue to GDP ratio in this country. But one thing we can do, but we have a subsidy problem. One thing we can do is to incentivize every worker first and foremost. Then we now know that, okay, we now have to deal with the informal sector. People who don't pay taxes, people who are artisans. How do we make their lives easier? That's where all of the subsidized transportation comes from. But again, as I said, we've bought buses in the past and all of that. After a year or two, they break down. Go and see Abuja Urban Mass Transit. There's a yard where they park thousands of the buses. But we can think differently now, and I think it's time for us to start to think differently about this issue.
How do we incentivize the Nigerian worker? There was a time where there were housing, there were state housing estates, federal housing estates that reduced cost of rent, but now you don't find those anymore. You're talking about incentivizing the worker. How do you incentivize the worker? You're giving them back money. You're putting money in their hands. But that money,
it's like you're increasing their salary.
My colleagues in Lagos are about to come in.
Without having to, there's this 40% they're playing with. Again, that's another, half-cooked idea, I'm sorry to say. We don't begin to leap in that kind of, even this 5,000, if you're giving households, all you're doing is that money, you're just going to increase inflation across the board. But if you're saying that, listen, okay, what we're trying to do is you're looking at increasing your transport allowances for those who work. And for those who don't work, okay, what can we do to begin to build sustainable transportation infrastructure across the board? Lagos may decide to put it in their inland waterway and buy a few more ferries for people. Other states that don't use ferries can begin to think in that regard. 400 billion is not particularly a lot of money, but it will help. It will help if it comes, but certainly not by putting the money, just 5,000 in so-called family funds and so on.
All right, I am Bukola.
Well, thank you, Nyota. Let me begin, Dr. Fasua, and thank you so much for the issues you've espoused so far. Well, Bukola and I were having a conversation here about this whole $800 million money. So just help us understand first, has the money been collected or it is yet to be collected, waiting for the approval of the Senate?
What I heard so far is that the money, that the FEC has approved for the collection of the money. I'm hoping it hasn't been collected. And that what the president was seeking
could have been collected.
Was the imprimatur of the Senate to go ahead and collect.
Dr. Fasua,
yes.
Just 1 second. Has it, I mean, you said you're hoping it hasn't been collected. Is there a likelihood that it could have been collected before the letter is sent to the Senate?
Well, I can't speak to that. That's the apparatus of government. Is left for them to deal with. Okay. But of course, look at, maybe people will be suspicious, and I think that's why there's anger in the land, unfortunately. Okay. For example, the case of the Ways and Means is still around the corner.
Which is where my question is, Dr. Fasua. Just a second. Which is where my question is. The Ways and Means conversation. Just 1 second. Let me come through on it. First of all, there are those who are saying, in the first place, over the years, over a long time now, the CBN has overreached itself by going past the constitutionally approved threshold of how much it should have collected in the first place. There are those who are asking the question around the CBN governor or the CBN overshooting the limit of 5% granted by the CBN Act, Section 38, by printing more than 23.7 trillion naira instead of 500 billion naira. That's an issue, isn't it? How serious is it in this whole ecosystem?
I wanted to tell you, no, it is a serious issue, but I'll quickly tell you that, look, every country was in that box, okay? Perhaps not in terms of the illegality against their laws, but every country was in the box of, you know, leaning on the central bank, especially through the time of COVID, when there was no work and no revenue collection. Every country did that, okay? But I'm not speaking for central bank. They will speak for themselves. However, also the 500 billion that you mentioned is a bit over bloated, because the 5% was specific as to the federal government revenue. So last year, the inland revenue collected 10.1 trillion. Out of that 10.1 trillion, perhaps 50-something% belongs to government, the federal government. So maybe 5 trillion. So yeah, you now look at 5% of 5 trillion, which is about 250 billion, max 300 billion. So 500 billion, we were being generous with that 500 million. So it's about, however, when you now look into history, you find out that in 2015, when Buhari government came, the account was overdrawn up to 790 billion, between 790 and 900 billion, meaning that even under the Jonathan government, that account was overdrawn. If you go back, you probably will find out that under
just 1 second, Dr.
the Yaradua government,
we'll come to the 2015, the pre-2015,
so of course,
the desktop. Just a second.
Yes.
But the issue you just raised, now, which you spaded, I'd like you to speak to it. And who should be taking it up, really? Is that the job for the National Assembly? You said that, yes, every country in the world was at the mercy of its central bank, but not to the level of illegality. Now, that illegality angle of it, who should be dealing with it? Who should make an issue of it? Or would you say that by extension, the National Assembly, the 9th National Assembly, failed in its duty of proper, adequate, efficient oversight of the CBN in this particular regard?
Well, of course, if they failed, they have also, at the end of the day, had to capitulate and, you know, say, okay, you know what, we've seen all the, I mean, they asked for details from the central bank. The central bank gave them details. They came back and said, you know what, they didn't want to approve before, but now we can go ahead and approve for the central bank what it has done. Because what happened was that amount was outstanding in the books of the central bank as mere overdraft, which had messed up the balance sheet of the central bank, and by extension, the balance sheet of the country. By what they have done now, that amount has been reclassified in the books of the central bank away from mere overdraft. When the bank gives an overdraft and is unpaid, you begin to talk about issues of bad loans and so on, you know, and issues of write-offs. But now it has been reclassified as a bond, perhaps as an asset in the book of the central bank that will be collected over, repaid over 40 years. That perhaps the best we can do is just an accounting classification. That amount could hardly also be taken to the public to be sold as bonds. The proper securitization, it would have had to be rated by a ratings agency, perhaps local and international, and then would have to sell off to members of the public, including especially institutional investors, who will then wait for repayment over time, but it was going to be very sticky. So what they have done is perhaps the best, and I think that by that singular approval, they have tried to sign off against that. And let me tell you this, that it's also not a big deal that such an amount will be reclassified in the books of a bank. When the U.S. spent $4.6 trillion on COVID alone, Nigeria spent about 30 to 40 billion. And if you convert that 30 to 40 billion dollars is 20 trillion. So begin to think about the amount of money that is in the Ways and Means account. So it's about 20 trillion. So, but what they did, like in the UK, the $430 billion they spend, once they spend those monies, when they issue the bonds, the Bank of England buys the bonds, and the money it shows up in the book of the Bank of England. I think that we should not constrict ourselves too much. And I also think that the 5% of last year's revenue that's recommended in the law is rather low. I think that we should give ourselves an opportunity for this economy to grow. That's my position on that.
And on the strength of that question, the incoming administration may be inheriting debt to the tune of 77 trillion naira. That's if you add the Ways and Means request to a debt stock of 44 trillion naira already. And it's coming with a lot of promises. They're going to do this and they're going to do that. And, it's also reminiscent of the Edo State governor's warning that, by the end of June, inevitably government will have to start printing money to pay salaries. So amid all of this, what in your own view should be the position of labor and civil society with regards, to the issue of fuel subsidy, for instance, in the light of the revenue challenge of government?
Thank you. But first of all, I usually disagree with Obaseki's views. I think his views are rather too far rightist for me, economically speaking. This is not investment banking. This is the lives of people. So, but however, that said, I think that also I read somewhere where 13 local governments generated 3 million naira in Edo State over a 6 months period. So everybody needs to get serious about generating revenue in order to be able to pay the salaries of their staff. We haven't actually started running this economy. 77 trillion naira, which over our GDP, GDP is about anything between 200 trillion to 230 trillion, which translates to almost $500 million, okay? So 77 over 200 is about 35%. Let's call it 35%. The truth is, when I looked at it and I went back and studied economic history as it pertains to the debts of nations, I found out that Nigeria has not started. The only reason why Nigeria will not be able to raise even more money anywhere, especially local bonds, I don't favor foreign because of the exchange risk which we are seeing now. We went down the foreign debt route under Kemi Adeosun full blast. But we warned then that there will be a point at which the monies that we borrowed at 199 naira to $1, if we have to pay back today, we will pay at least 460 official rate, meaning that we have to tax our people times 3. And God knows where the rate is going, but we hope that the rate can be managed, Again, I must quickly say again, I'll keep giving this warning, that if the government is going to remove subsidy, the incoming government, they must find a way of ensuring that the naira is not the value. Because when Buhari removed subsidy, actually in 2016, when fuel went from 87 naira to 145 naira, the mistake they did was to devalue the naira from 199 to 360, meaning that the 145 naira went back to the same dollar value that 87 was. And so it went back to 40 cents. And at the end of the day, NNPC started accruing, what they call under recovery, which was another subsidy. So essentially speaking, 77 is, if we're talking about 35% of debt to GDP, we have an opportunity to raise even more debt comparatively. Angola is sitting on 100% debt to GDP, Ghana 100%, Kenya's 80%, Egypt 80%, UK 110%, US 130%, Japan 260%, Greece 260%, France 160%, Italy 180%. The only reason you will not raise more debt is if you have no idea what to do with money. Now look at Nigeria and tell me that we don't have anything to do with money. Our people are suffering. We need infrastructure. We need to build a real economy. We need to incentivize the industrial sector. So why then would we say that we cannot raise money? So, of course, the problem we have is that we always would wait until disaster before we go and raise money, and we'll spend the money and fritter it away on managing disaster, on corruption, on accountability. But if we have a proper plan, and I'm hoping that the incoming administration has a proper plan and you know, have a collegiate system of thinkers in government, there's so much, and we would actually begin to start this economy. There's a lot to do. We can incentivize the agricultural sector, value add, you know, incentivize people who want to invest in that sector, who want to add value to all of the products that we sell in this country, so that we begin to talk about a proper economy going forward. Okay. I see it as opportunity. I don't see it as much of a threat for now.
Dr. Fasua, real quick, in like 10 seconds. Right. One word of advice for the government, present and incoming.
This government, the word of advice as it pertains to this is they should forget that idea. You know, they shouldn't further just continue to anger Nigerians who are, you know, many Nigerians are very emotional about this issue. You know, no need to continue to rub, you know, to salt to the injury. For the incoming government, you know, be very collegiate. We hope that they're going to be running a very intellectual government where all of these issues will be properly discussed. People with ideas will come on board and also get ideas from the members of the public. The CSOs and co will should continue to do their work to ensure that the government stay on the straight and narrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've been speaking with Dr. Tokpe Fasua, economist, public policy scholar, and in 2019 presidential candidate, Abundant Nigeria Renewal Party. Thank you for coming in this morning.
You're welcome, sir.